Hello and welcome to Csit 301 Mobile Application Development. Today we want to talk about Apache Cordova. Apache Cordova, like I mentioned earlier, is the framework where Worklight is built on top of. In this section, we seek to explain its capabilities, that's of the Apache Cordova framework, and we want to describe APIs that support them. At the end of this session, every student should be able to understand the capabilities of Apache Cordova framework. Every student should be able to use Apache Cordova framework to access native device functions, and finally be able to develop Apache Cordova plugin. So the three areas we want to focus on today are Apache Cordova. We'll have a brief overview of that. Then we'll look at how to create plugin both in Android and for iOS. And then finally, we'll talk about something they call the Web View Overlay. We'll look at the Web View Overlay plugin too. Okay. As always, the materials that support this would be loaded in the Sakai. Please do well to have a look at them. Okay, so Apache Cordova is an open source mobile development framework. Now, at some point in time, there was a need for a framework that will help develop mobile applications across all platforms by just doing it once. So then, that's where Apache Cordova came from. So some group of people sat down and decided that they were going to use common technologies or tools, CSS, JavaScript, HTML, and then find a very robust way of building mobile applications. And that gave birth to Apache Cordova. Now, it provides a JavaScript API that allows developers to access native mobile device features. So Apache Cordova is going to actually be the bridge between the mobile phone and your mobile application. Now, this is where Worklight sits on top of. So Worklight sits on top of Apache Cordova, making it very robust, very secured, adding in extra features to the Apache Cordova so that we can also get to develop, or developers can now seamlessly build mobile applications. Now, this framework, like we've been seeing for some earlier sessions, is integrated into iOS and Android. And we're able to achieve that by creating a Worklight project and then finally adding the various platforms which we want to develop for onto that project. Now, if you've built a Worklight application and you haven't actually gone through to have a thorough look at all the code or all the files, then you might not have seen this. But Apache Cordova is integrated into every Worklight project. Now, when we look carefully at the screen, we would realize that some of the scripts, the JavaScripts that have been imported into the HTML file are actually Cordova files. So you would see the source here has Worklight Cordova.js. So Cordova is actively used in Worklight. Now, when we navigate also, especially when we add a particular platform, let's say Android or iOS or the Windows, you would see that you have bits and portions of Apache Cordova also built into that place. So here also we see the iPhone, and then we can see that there's the Cordova, demo Cordova app iPhone, and then we have the Cordova lib. So that's where the library resides. And when we come to the Windows Phone project also, you would see a similar version, Cordova plugins.js, and then the Cordova.js. And finally, for the Android platform, you are going to see the Cordova plugin.jar and then the Cordova.jar. So the Cordova is actively involved in our Worklight project. Now, there's a Cordova object that we can actually interact with if we always want to access some device functions. Now, this Cordova object provides support for other device-related functions, such as the device hardware and software information, and also lifecycle events. Now, we talk about device ready, when the device has paused, resumed, online, offline, back button, and several of these events. And also it gives us access to file-related objects to read, write, and navigate file system hierarchies. So we have directory entry, directory reader, we have the file entry, we have lots of them, and all of this is provided by the Cordova object. And then lastly, we would also see that there's the media objects for us to record and play back audio files. So Cordova, you can see, is cutting across a lot of the functionalities that we would want to be accessing on our device. Now what we have here is an example displaying a native alert. So with Cordova, we can now display a native alert. Now when we talk about native, we are saying that the alert that is originally developed or is originally showcased on a particular platform. So like we have an iOS, if you want to use their native alert system through Cordova, you would be able to access that. And so you see that the same code that is being shown, navigator notification alert, that same code on an iOS is given as an iOS alert, on an Android is given as a typical native alert. And this slide also is given as an example where we are able to retrieve information. So we talked about the Cordova object, where we are able to now retrieve software and hardware information. So here in our sample code or code snippet, you can see that the inner HTML is going to display some information about the current device. And here we have the device.name, which is going to give us the device name. The device.cordova is giving us the Cordova version. We have the device.platform, device.uuid, device.version. Now when this is run on an iOS, we can see a snapshot of that also and what it produces. When it's run on an Android, we can see the results of that also. Okay, so there are times where as a developer, there are things you want to do, and even though Cordova and Worklight has a huge, it's made up of huge functionalities, there are times where you would want to extend that functionality. Now Cordova allows you to build plugin to extend its capabilities or functionalities. So we now want to look at how to create such a plugin. Okay, so like I said, sometimes developers might need to use a specific third-party native library or a device function. Now, Cordova is allowing you as a developer to create custom native code blocks and invoke them via JavaScript. This technique is what we call, or what they call, the Cordova plugin. So this is how the Cordova plugin is going to run. We are going to write some code in our native, in the native language of that particular device. If it's Android, we are writing Java. If it's iOS, we are writing Objective-C or Swift. And then through some mechanisms provided by Cordova, we would now be able to call and execute that particular piece of code written natively. Okay, so an Apache Cordova plugin consists of two main parts to get this plugin running. The first part is the native code that is going to run on the device's operating system. So for Android, like I said, we are doing Java. For iOS, we are doing Objective-C. And then after, we would need a wrapper. Now this wrapper is going to be a JavaScript wrapper. So we need two pieces. The first piece is the native code. The second piece is the JavaScript wrapper. Now we want to look at how we would create a native plugin class for Android. Now to implement a plugin, like we said, the first part of it is the Java class. So we need to create a Java class for the plugin. Now, for this to work, that class needs to extend a particular class that has been provided by Cordova, and that is the Cordova plugin. So the signature of the class is going to be as follows, and like we are seeing on the slide, you would have public class, the name of your plugin, but then it should extend Cordova plugin. And then also it should implement the execute method. So it should extend that interface, and and then it should execute that method or implement that method. And now, like I said, the plugin class should now implement the execute method. So we are going to look at what the execute method would do and what parameters it takes. Okay, so the first one is the action. Is an input parameter which indicates the plugin action to execute. So that means that we could have several actions in our plugin. We could have maybe open door, close door action. We could have several. So based on the action that is passed to the execute method, then that particular code gets executed and what it has to do gets done. Now, the parameters for action are passed in a JSON array. So the parameters that you need to feed to that action. So in a case where it's an open door action, let's say, any parameter that is needed to make that run successfully is going to be passed in a JSON array. And then there's the callback context. Now this will specify how to call back to JavaScript. Okay, so we are now looking at the code snippet, which is telling us how this execute can be run or implemented. So you will see that the action is a string, like I said, is the name of that action or part of the code you want to call or run. Because your plugin could do several things and you would want to describe them with actions. So this action is going to tell which piece of the code or the plugin is going to get executed. And then the array is the JSON array that's going to be passed to that particular function. You might have it that is going to execute that. And then the callback context is how we are now going to finally get back to our JavaScript. Okay, so here the action here says say hello. So the snippet here is checking if that is the action that the user wants to execute or that the application is trying to reach natively, then that is what's going to happen. So after that, action is equal to say hello, then it goes on, processes based on the arguments, so then you can use the arguments for whatever logic you want to use them for. Then finally you do the callback success, and then whatever response data you want sent, that is going to be sent to your application.